Hello, everyone, and welcome to our virtual discussion of author Shayda Kafai's Crip Kinship. We have Shayda and Nomy Lamm here today for a discussion, and we have copies of Crip Kinship in this Orca Books bookstore as well, and I'll put a link in the chat box if you would like to order online. But for now, I would love to introduce Shayda and her work. In recent years, disability activism has come into its own as a vital and necessary means to acknowledge the power and resilience of the disabled community and to call out ableist culture wherever it appears. Crip Kinship explores our activism of Sins Invalid, a San Francisco Bay Area-based performance project, and its radical imaginings of what disabled, queer, trans, and gender non-conforming body minds of color can do, how they can rewrite oppression, and how they can gift us with transformational lessons for our collective survival. Grounded in their disability justice framework, Crip Kinship investigates the revolutionary survival teachings that disabled queer of color communities offer to all our body minds. From their focus on Crip beauty and sexuality to manifesting digital kinship networks and Crip-centric liberated zones. Sins Invalid empowers and moves us toward generating our collective liberation from our body minds outward. And Shayda and Nomy, I would love to give the floor to you.
Thank you so much. Hello, Nomy.
Hi, I'm so glad to be here. And thank you to Orca Books. This is so awesome.
Yeah, thank you all so much for having us. Thank you to our ASL interpreters and our captioners. So we want to begin with image descriptions. Yeah, okay, I'll go first. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us. My name is Shayda. I have short black hair with bangs going to the left side. I'm wearing violet lipstick today with big wire diamond-shaped earrings, a gray shirt, and I have tattoos on my arms. And I am at my aunt and uncle's house in their living room.
I am Nomy, and I'm putting on earrings because I forgot, and now I was reminded. I'm a fat, white, Jewish, non-binary femme person wearing a very sparkly sequin turquoise headband, and my hair is kind of like up in a bun. Is dark hair. I'm wearing a dress that has white and black diagonal stripes, and there's some straps across my chest, and I'm wearing a pink sparkly scarf, and behind me is tapestry with intersecting orbs kind of situation. Also, I just want to name that I'm on Squaxin Nisqually Chehalis land in so-called Olympia, Washington. Oh, I apologize, I didn't give the interpreters those names. I will write them in the chat of the First Peoples.
I will do the same. I'm coming in from Keach Gabrielino territory, what is named as LA County. So while we type, Nomy, since you typed first and you were faster, let me ask you, because I think it's so powerful for us to name our origin stories and how we both came to Sins Invalid. And something that I noticed, I think you and I have been in conversation, an email conversation with one another since about 2011, which I think is beautiful to name also. But how did you come to Sins Invalid?
Thank you. Yeah, it's so amazing to read this book and see this history that is in some ways really familiar, and in some ways, like, you know, everyone has their own story of how we got involved. And for me, I had I'm disabled since birth, and grew up here in Olympia in the punk scene, and was very politicized around feminism and queerness, and somewhat around disability, but I had like 2 disabled friends. And then the rest of my politicization around disability was more around specifically around trauma, and impacts of trauma that are obviously related to disability. I was in Chicago for like 4 years and then came back to Olympia to get on Social Security and while I then was in transition getting ready to move to the Bay Area. And in that moment, Leroy Moore, who is one of the co-founders of Sins Invalid, read something that I wrote and reached out and was like, I love your politics. You should be involved with Sins. And I was in this place. I don't know if anybody here has ever had to apply for Social Security, but you can't do anything. Like they need to think that you are 100% incapacitated for them to like approve you. And so I was like, oh, I really can't do anything right now, but I'm excited to meet you. And once I was in San Francisco, we connected and just hung out and talked about art and disability. And at that point, they had formed like an artist core, or I think they called it a performer core. So they had their performers all set. They weren't looking for anyone new. I was like, okay, well, let me come volunteer in the lobby selling tickets. So they had already done one show, which you talk about in the book, how it was like originally conceived as a one-time performance. So I came to the second one in 2007 and sold tickets in the lobby, and missed the beginning of the show, which is like famously like Leroy crawling around on the floor and like drinking out of a dog bowl. Like it was like this wild kind of BDSM scene. Missed that. But the show, I mean, I think it was like a 3-hour long show. It was so long, but it was so incredibly engaging. Like I mean, it's in your book. Like there were not spaces that had disabled people in our wholeness, talking about, yeah, being whole people and sharing our brilliant art. And something in me, I was like, it was very physical. Like my body was like vibrating, like, oh, this is like the dream that I didn't know I had, but kind of always had in the back of my mind. And this is where I want to be. This is really important. And then halfway through the year or so, Patty Byrne, who's the other co-founder and the artistic director of Sins Invalid, reached out and was like, hey, you want to hang out and get to know each other? I was like, yes. And I came over and did not know that it was like part of her agenda that she was looking for performers at that time. So we hung out for a few hours. And by the end of it, she was like, sing me a song. And I sang her a song. And she was like, that's great. I want that in the show. And so I was in the 2008 performance and then have been in every performance since. And I'm now the creative director of Sins Invalid, which is a different role than artistic director. But is, you know, I do a lot of the just like creative work that you see in the organization. Right now, I'm working on a coloring book that has 26 artists. It's a disability justice from A to Z coloring book. And yeah, that's a short version of my history with Sins. What about you?
I love that. I think we all need that coloring book. I'm looking forward to receiving this coloring book. I mean, I appreciate your story, and I think that we both came to Sins Invalid with longing. So I was very much aware of my queerness and my madness, and I was learning about disability studies, and it was really interesting, and I was really enjoying it. And I had this really profound moment of looking at my bookshelf and looking at the authors on my bookshelf, right? And realizing that a lot of my books and these discussions around disability were being had by a lot of male identified folks, a lot of white folks. And as a person of color, as a queer person of color, as a femme, I was very curious to see what are conversations that are happening within these intersecting community spaces around disability. And so I started looking, and one of my friends who had lived in San Francisco for a while said, well, have you heard of Sins Invalid? And I hadn't, and I was living in Southern California, and I couldn't go to a performance, but I had my laptop. And so for folks that haven't seen any of the archived footage, I'll put the link in the chat. So I went on Sins Invalid's website and I started looking at the archival footage, and it was me, my laptop, and my small apartment. That became my first like window and entry point. And even though it was just me and nobody else was there, I still had that feeling of, I felt satiated, I felt excited. And it wouldn't be for a few years later until I was able to go and actually see a performance in person. And like, talk about like the wild experience of going somewhere and having your needs met without you having to ask for your needs to be met. Like, it was this incredible cross disability space. I was at the Brava Theater in San Francisco's Mission District, and there were gender neutral restrooms and roomy seats for everybody's body and a quiet room, which my like anxiety brain really loved. It was low to free scent. There was ASL, there were visual descriptions. I mean, it was a space in which I had never been. And I haven't been in since. And so that kind of started my just realization that our body minds are really, really powerful and hold really potent lessons. And Sins Invalid is what brought me to those lessons. And then I got to meet you and other amazing folks who, for folks that don't, I mean, y'all have been so generous with your time and your stories and your wisdom. And so that's how all of this started. And it was in 2010 for me.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. That, I mean, that makes me think about, in your book, you talk a lot about Crip-centered liberated zones, and what you just described sounds like that. And I'm wondering if you can share a little bit more about what a Crip-centered liberated zone is and examples of when you've experienced that.
Yeah. It was an idea that I came across when Patty and I first spoke. And I was asking if, like, what's a good description of what Sins Invalid like fosters and provides people? And Patty said it's a Crip-centric liberated zone. And I couldn't even envision what that looked like. And I was like, I need to know more. Like, this sounds like an amazing place. Like, what happens in these places? And the way that Patty described it was, it's very much a fluid space. It could be temporary in the sense that it could be in the space of one of these evenings of performance, or in the space of a workshop or a training. And it's very much a space that's created out of love and a desire for our collective liberation and survival. And most profoundly, it's a space in which we can enter as queer, gender nonconforming, trans, disabled folks of color, chronically ill folks, mad folks, where we can be made familiar to ourselves because we're existing in a liberated space, not a space of constant oppression and navigation that we have to do on a daily basis. And so that idea of like, we can be made familiar to ourselves again, in systems that have so separated us from our sense of self, was so powerful for me. And yeah, the space that I was describing with all of those different access needs being met so generously, that can be a Crip-centric liberated zone. Me having conversations with other Crips and other femmes online, and us really holding space for each other and asking to do check-ins and capacity needs That's a Crip-centric liberated zone. And I think in many ways, me watching those first recordings of Sins Invalid transformed my little studio apartment into a Crip-centric liberated zone that night. Yeah, and I wonder if there are like embodied reactions that you get from being in Crip-centric liberated zones, or rather performing in them for you, Nomy. I feel like I have a sense of what the space is. And the more I think about the times I've been in it, it feels very medicinal, very healing for my body, mind, spirit. And yeah, I guess I'm wondering if you have similar like embodied experiences and minded experiences in those places.
Yeah. I mean, I think the thing that I mentioned, to me, it feels very spiritual. It feels like my whole self is engaged in a different way that is like that kind of like tingling aliveness. And it's not like I'm in that state all the time. Like problems still happen, like there are conflicts there, it's like also part of the world and part of life. But there's this sense, like to me, I'm Jewish, and a big part of my work is around calling in the world to come, which is this concept that it's interpreted in lots of different ways. But what you were just saying makes me feel like, oh, it's the world to come. Like it's like what we're like the future that we can envision, like we're bringing that little pieces and tastes of that into this world to say like, oh, this is possible. And it doesn't mean we're living outside of the reality that we're in, but it's like drawing on our imagination and bringing it into the now and being like, what do you actually need? I mean, just even asking for people to name their access needs as we enter a space together is so revolutionary. And I've been in so many spaces where people are like, nobody's ever asked me what I need before, It's like we're so used to conforming ourselves to the environments that we're in, and the assumptions that like aren't even necessarily assumptions we've all agreed to. It's just what we believe has to be. And I will say that the more I'm in disability justice spaces, there's so much care and so much tending and so much intention. And there's also, it's very difficult. Like our access needs are not always in alignment with each other's. And so, it really does take a lot of work, and it takes a lot more work than it needs to because we live in capitalism. And yeah, I could go on and on about that.
You're here.
But I do want to say, I also want to say Shabbat Shalom to everybody. We are entering into this like 25-hour period of rest and just beingness, and having this event at this time is really highlighting all of these resonances between my Jewish practice and disability justice practice. And on that note, just in terms of like being able to rest and tend and let down our guards. And I just want to name that your book, when I read it, I feel so much warmth from you and so much care in your poetry. And you're telling a story, and it's a story of a lot of people. And it's really amazing how well you're able to hold it. And I'm curious if you have thoughts about whether and how being femme plays into the way that you approach this kind of movement work.
Well, we're talking about tenderness. I'm so that made me very emotional and teary, and I think it's important, an important part of my own femme politics. It's connected to disability justice. It's connected to my understanding of my queerness and my madness. And You know, one of the things that feminist has taught me, and this kind of made me think about what you were sharing around like manifesting the dreams we have for our futures now, in these crip-centric liberated zones. Um, Disability justice has taught me that, right? That we deserve to have futures and we deserve to dream our futures into reality. And so a lot of that intersects with my feminists. And I think the biggest thing that really guided the writing of this work, and I'm so glad that that was like an embodied sensation that you had when you were reading, was that I have not just a permission to be tender and vulnerable in telling stories, in doing movement work, or in teaching when I'm like on campus and I'm in a classroom. So not that I have permission to do those things, but that those things are absolutely necessary and integral to my survival. And I've learned this from other disabled, mad, chronically ill femmes of color. And so I feel like it's important for folks to know. So this book, Dream, started in 2012 when I started my dissertation. And y'all, it did not look like this. It did not sound like this. It was not written in poetry. It was not holding all the stories that it is. And I stepped away. I graduated in 2014 and then came back to it in 2016 and really let all the powerful narratives that you all and other folks who were part of disability justice were teaching me. And I let the poetry and I let the stories guide the writing of the book, as opposed to theory, which is important. Like, I'm a nerd for life. Like, I think theory is awesome, but I think there's something more resonant and somatic with stories, right? And so I couldn't do this project without the femme practice of, and also the crip practice of slowness. It took a long time to write. So 2016 until 2021, right, was when it was finished. And I think, again, you brought up capitalism. Our capitalist mandates of productivity demand that things have to be done quickly, and that we sacrifice our body, mind, spirits for that speed. But my feminist kind of pulled that back a little bit and allowed me to slow down, create my writing altar, have practices that I engage in as I write to remember it's not just me in a room, it's me around community. And I think the other really big gift of feminists, and then I'm so excited to like talk more about like your understanding of feminists and movement building. Most of this was written in like connection with community. So I was always, whether before the pandemic, I was in like a coffee shop with a community member, a friend working, or during the pandemic, we were on a Zoom call like this, and we were all checking in, naming our capacity for the day, for the writing day. What are our intentions for the writing day? And then we would do check-ins and we would eat together and we would, vent through our struggles. And if we had met the capacity for the day, we would support each other in inviting one another to stop working for the day. And I think that co-creation and generating knowledge and community is so interwoven with feminists, with like a mad femme politic, that it very much informed the writing of the book. And when folks read it, that's why the intro at the end of it, there's an invitation to you all to read and move through the text as you need to, taking breaks if you need to, eating, stretching, coming to it and engaging with it in a way that is honoring yourselves as you move through it. That's a juicy question, by the way. Thank you for asking it. I got so excited when I read it. I was like, oh yeah, we must talk about this.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much of that kind of labor of tending to webs of relationships and making sure that people's needs are met and giving people permission to be how they are, and you know, dealing with crises when they come up, and just so much of that labor that's been invisibilized for so long and is not usually paid labor and is not really valued in movement work a lot of times, or it's like, you know, the whole movement is totally dependent upon it, but it's not seen as like the really important work of like changing the system, but it's actually like the core of what we have to actually get back to, and like it's like the only thing that's going to really save us, you know, is being able to be in like true relationship with ourselves and each other. And so I really appreciate that. And as somebody who actually has a very hard time with theory, I think it's really awesome how warm and accessible your writing is. And I think that it's going to make this book speak to a lot of people who otherwise might be alienated by like disability studies. So thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, of course. And I have to give a shout out to one of my writing buddies and friends who's here. Hi, Julia. Julia and I wrote together, worked together. So yeah, I think, and you know, the book is full of dear femmes that I've interviewed who've shared their wisdom. And so yeah, making this accessible for everybody, a book for everybody.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, and it reminds me too, just, I mean, Sins Invalid was founded, I mean, Sins Invalid is a revolutionary project. I mean, really at its core, it's about like overturning systems of oppression, including capitalism and colonialism and patriarchy, and, you know, and a key element of it is disabled sexuality, which I feel like is just hardly ever acknowledged. And if it is, it's like such this niche thing about, mm, you know, like disabled people can have sex too. The end. Or, you know, it's like, oh my God, there's so much there. And there's actually so much there for people to learn from. Like, all of us have bodies. We're all in relationship with these bodies that are not machines. They are complicated, and our relationships to them are complicated, and the ways that we interface with each other around pleasure and pain and trauma and healing and is just like, it's so much. There's so much to it. And so the fact that sexuality has, and disabled sexuality has always been so core to Sins Invalid's work and practice and agenda is like really is part of what made it so compelling for me, and I think for a lot of people. And I'm so grateful too that there's, you know, I feel like more and more there are people doing the work of bringing pleasure into focus as a critical element of revolutionary change. And so, yeah, I'm just sometimes, you know, it's for me, I was just talking about this earlier today, just the ways that like beauty and pleasure are things that have been very fraught in my life, like extremely challenged. And that because of that, I'm like obsessed with them and obsessed with like making them accessible and nurturing and bringing in practices that can help us to understand beauty and pleasure outside of commodification of like some system of hierarchy and, you know, deserving or like what can be marketed. Um and so, you know, sometimes I think that my work historically, because a lot of my work early on was around fat oppression, and I was in the punk scene, and people would be like, well, that's not, you know, that's not important in the realm of like punk rock. And I'm like, yes, it fucking is. And um, I'm just so grateful that there's more and more, um, you know, respect for and centering of beauty and pleasure as things that we all need in order to want to be alive. And that's the goal, right? To want to be here and create this world together. I'm curious if you have thoughts about that.
Oh, I have my brain's going into many directions. The first thing I was thinking about was, I think going back to what you were saying about Sins Invalid and the revolutionariness of their work. I think for lots of folks, it's the first time they also find out that imperialism, colonialism, sorry, the phone's ringing, and all of these other things intersect with disability. So I think that idea of shifting the lens, thinking about pleasure and sexuality, I think is really, really important. And I'm thinking about Adrienne Maree Brown's book, Pleasure Activism, right? And as a way for us to think about love and pleasure as being super important parts of our movement building work. Like, we come into movement building work with our bodies, y'all. Like, just we have to talk about everything. And one of the biggest lessons, so I very much enjoy and recommend that everybody checks out Sins Invalids series called Crip Bits. I'll put it in the chat. It's on Facebook. I believe some of them are on YouTube, but I think the majority, like the hub, is on Facebook, right?
YouTube is getting really updated, so they're all there, and it's going to be more accessible momentarily.
Oh, perfect. Okay, thank you. So there are a few episodes in the Crip Bits series where there are conversations around pleasure and disability, cripping sex. What does that mean? What could that look like? And it becomes this really powerful lesson of learning from crip, mad, chronically ill bodies outward around how we can re-dream ideas around sex and what sex means. Because I think you're right. A lot of the messaging I got too, and I think so many of us get around beauty and sexuality is commodity. It's informed by white supremacy. It's most certainly informed by sizeism and ableism. And to think about cripping beauty and to think about cripping sexuality really explodes those norms and says, what do we want to replace them with? And I feel like a lot of the performance work and the workshops that Sins Invalid does are evidence, proof of what we can replace that with. There was this phenomenal Crip Bits episode with India Harville, and India was sharing just all the different ways we can think of adaptive tenderness and love and rest and pauses entering into spaces of sex that very much go against whatever normative stuff, I can say shit, right? Whatever normative shit we've been taught, to really kind of shift the narrative and see how do we want to reimagine sex, and how do we want to reimagine beauty, and who could it be for? Everyone? What would that mean? So yeah, I like how this conversation of dreaming that you brought up at the beginning is kind of like weaving its way through this dialogue, because it's very rebellious to dream, and to realize that you have capacity to dream, and you are allowed to dream and then manifest something than what you are seeing and experiencing on a daily basis.
And we need those models. We need to be able to see that, people before us have been dreaming these dreams, and we can diverge from them and create different dreams. But it's like, if we don't even know that there's something to dream towards, how do you do that? Like, I remember as a child trying to envision my future, and the closest that I could come was like Cyndi Lauper, Girls Just Want to Have Fun. Like that was like, I was like, something like that, something kind of like that, it's like, somewhere to start from. So I'm so glad that like young Crips coming into the world and into themselves now have something like Sins Invalid and this book to look towards and be like, oh, this is here for me to use as a foundation.
And this is maybe a good time too to just spotlight the Skin, Tooth, and Bone text. So for folks that are curious about disability justice, what's the timeline, the history of disability justice? What are its principles? What are practical ways you can apply it to your own events and your own organizing? How is it connected to sex, pleasure, deafhood? All of those things are in this one powerful primer text that you can buy on Sins Invalid's website, which if you want to talk a little bit more about it, I'll go ahead and drop the link in the chat for everyone.
Sure, yeah. This is the second edition of Skin, Tooth, and Bone. It came out in 2019, I think. I'm holding up a copy of it. It's got like brown and pink, and there's like octopus tentacles and spine that's curved, and what I call a crip flower. It's like this beautiful flower that grew in its own unique way, and it's spiral bound, which is intentional for accessibility purposes because a lot of people, it's hard to like hold a book open. Yeah, it's the first edition was kind of like compiling a lot of work that we had done already and being like, we need to be able to share this. We need, people are talking about disability justice a lot, and we want to be able to document the work we've done and get it into the world. And then from there, we asked for a lot of feedback, what was missing, and that led to us also creating kind of revamping and trying to use more accessible language throughout the whole thing, creating a glossary, creating these timelines, both of Sins Invalid and disability justice. And then a big thing was, the relationship between disabled and deaf communities is complicated, and we are, neither community can, to say there's total overlap. There are people who are deaf and disabled. And these communities have their own kind of identities and politics and language. And we like hearing people who are disabled don't get to define what is disability justice for deaf communities. And so there was, and we have deaf performers that we work with. But I think we hadn't really been accountable to deaf community. And so by getting feedback that needed to be part of the primer, it started conversations where at first I was reaching out and trying to commission deaf writers to take a look at our primer and write contributions of like, what are the intersections and how do these communities resonate together? And then was getting all these submissions and then communicating with the authors, and then they're like, well, who's editing this? Because I don't want to be edited by hearing people. And so then there was kind of like a crew of writers and then a couple of editors who did the editing, and it's kind of a whole section. And one of the things that it was interesting when I was reading your book, I saw the word deafness, and I was like, oh, this was something that was very clear in, so I want to name Cascadia Deaf Nation is one of the organizations that we have worked with quite a bit, and specifically Ashanti Monstraviska, who is one of the founders of Cascadia Deaf Nation. That I think it was Ashanti who was like, we prefer the language of deafhood, not deafness. And so I actually opened up the glossary to the term deafhood so that I can share that. And it says, this is a term that was coined by Patty Ladd that conveys a positive association with the experience of being deaf and the process of coming into and developing a deaf identity throughout one's life. And that was a new term to me. I didn't know it before. And when we would then have other people editing or, reading over the text, there was a lot of like, oh, well, this and this, the language that is being used by deaf people when writing in English, it has different syntax than hearing people's language. And there was a lot of like, no, that is not going to be edited more. This is the community that wrote and edited this, and this is how it's supposed to be. And that's something that we're, within Sins Invalid, we have taken on a commitment to language justice, which is like a whole world that we, while there's been elements of it in our work, is a way that we are able to meet the communities who really should be central to disability justice, which includes deaf communities and Spanish-speaking communities. There are many others as well, but this is the commitment we're taking on now, is by the end of 2022 that all of our offerings be available in ASL and in Spanish, as well as English. And so we are learning so much in this process, and it's really exciting to be like, okay, there are communities that we want to be in connection with, we want to be learning from, that theoretically are totally centered in disability justice principles. And now we are choosing to really be in more direct collaboration, and grow our communities in that way. So yeah.
I think that's so important. I was so grateful when you emailed me about the language and, hey, can we talk about this? Because it, like, one of the most, I think, exciting things of just being a human, but also doing community work and writing and being in community with other people is learning and being accountable. And so I'm already dreaming, like, what would it look like to shift language around for the reprint? How do we do that? I've reached out to my editor. And so I'm very excited to take this information and then receive it with love. Because at first I thought, oh my God, I fucked up. I should have researched that more. But then I was like, no, this is like the beautiful work that happens in organizing and community work. How do you move forward by, in accountable ways? And, so I'm just really excited that we're having this conversation, one, and two, that language justice has woven in as a very, has become a very powerful part of what Sins Invalid is offering.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think it's,
go ahead. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say, what a powerful extension, what a powerful extension too of another example of what we can manifest in Crip-centric liberated zones and offer. So yeah, that just makes me very excited.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the key things about language justice is that it's not something where it's like, oh, we're going to provide this service to these people. It's like, oh, we all have things to teach each other, and we can only do that if we can communicate with each other. And I'm even aware in my language when I'm talking about when I say we, I realize what I'm speaking to is Sins Invalid staff, because that's who I experience as, Sins Invalid. But I also know that Sins Invalid and really disability justice as a bigger framework, that's not something that anybody owns. I mean, if anyone owns it, it's like the most marginalized people, right? And so that's an interesting dynamic around doing the work in a way, that's accountable and reflective, and realizing, as one of few white people involved with Sins Invalid. Like, how am I participating in this in a way as a person who is in leadership, but really careful not to take up space that isn't mine or try to own things that aren't mine to own. And yeah, I really want to be in community, like, yeah.
I mean, what lovely, because having agency and autonomy are these important parts of, I'm thinking of the different principles of disability justice, like leadership from the most impacted in particular, but what wonderful examples too of not just self-love, but community love, and what that means. There is a chapter in the book, I think it's chapter 3. I was asking Patty it is chapter 3. I was asking Patty if there were specific moments of growth and learning that have come up since Sins Invalid began in 2006, and what were they? And one of the things that Patty was sharing was this lovely book. It's called The Hidden Life of Trees. And it was talking about how root systems can speak, like trees can speak to one another. And it talked about mycelium networks. And just all these different ways that nature has voice and is in conversation with the different components that make it up in a very loving, to use that word that you brought up, tender and symbiotic way. And those are some ways to move and practice community love and be accountable and vulnerable and honest. And I keep also thinking about our now ancestor Bell Hooks, who wrote a lot about love as activism and love as politics. So yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking, like, if there were ways or moments where, for me at least, watching Sins Invalid and interacting with members of Sins Invalid, I noticed love was a very important politic and practice, where it's this deliberate decision that is made. And again, not just self-love and the way we've been thinking about love in many ways through commodity and capitalist culture, but like, what could community love be and offer?
Yeah. And I think sometimes, I mean, I really love the it's a metaphor, but it's also just the truth of the ways that we're connected through our roots. Like, that, like, there can be conflict and there can be, sometimes a moving away or a stepping back, or some people need a chance to get more sunshine. And so being like, okay, I'm gonna, hold myself in a different way, but we're all connected through our roots and sharing these nutrients with each other. And I think, I do think self-love is so core to that, to being able to hold ourselves in integrity while we're in relationship with each other. And I think, just like everything in our culture is something that tries to get marketed to us, even the most like true natural things that nobody can own. And the fact that like self-love and self-care have become these, like, do some yoga poses and take a picture and put it on Instagram for likes or whatever, is like, so actually damage. I mean, there's benefits to it too. I know, like, for people who are isolated and need access to examples, that I think that social media can be useful for that. But when it's trying to sell you something or make you actually feel bad about yourself, it's like, that's not it. But I think being able to have love for ourselves when we're in deep struggle, whatever kind of struggle that is, and also know that we are being held by each other no matter what. Yeah.
I'm really loving how this metaphor of like roots and trees is informing the conversation. And I'm also thinking too about how a big part of my experience with Sims Invalid and other folks who've like come with me to see performances, or we've seen performances at home, like the October online performance, but it's very much about inviting those who witness to grow and create shifts either in their community spaces or in their body, mind, spirits, or in their lives in different ways. So I love this idea of growth, like imagining it in very like tangible and also beautiful metaphoric ways.
And hopefully ways that also move us toward action.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Mutual aid and showing up in the ways that we're really needed by each other and by this moment. I think with climate chaos can be so defeating. A lot of our work in the last few years has been around climate chaos, and it is so serious. It's just so heavy, and who knows if we'll survive it. And we want our disabled communities to survive, and people aren't thinking about us. Our government certainly isn't thinking about us. And so it's really important to be highlighting disabled people of color, queer and trans voice, and fat people. Like fat people are like very, very vulnerable in this pandemic that we're in, and with anything having to do with healthcare in general, like that we like really care about each other is like the foundation of being able to resist and survive.
Oh, I love that. I'm wondering, I had a sneaky feeling that this was just going to zoom by, and it did. I don't know if this is a good time or if this is okay even to open space for questions if anybody has any. Thank you all for hanging out with us.
And if people have questions, you can they just unmute and talk, or you could raise your hand if you want, or
Type it in the chat box.
And I also know Sakura has some questions too.
I just put a question in the chat box, but I could also read it aloud. You say you wrote the book in Crip time early on in the text, and you define Crip time as the active bending time to the need of the body-mind, rather than contorting the body-mind to fit the parameters of time. I think about capitalism's version of time. So in other words, you talk about how the text took the perfect amount of time to be written. It was slow, and you invite the reader to read at their own pace. And I guess I'm curious about the relationship between Crip time and your personal writing process, and what happens for you creatively when you allow things to take the time that they need.
That's such a great question. You know, I never realized that writers have a shared experience with writing where the expectation is that we're taught we should just sit, write, and it's going to be perfect and magical. And it often is very magical. But I read this article by Gloria Anzaldúa where she very vulnerably like shared like, hey, I have the intention to sit down and write. And then I wake up the next day and my diabetes pain is preventing me from writing. And it was the first time that I read an author that I absolutely admired, speaking very vulnerably about the act of writing and this this role of permission that needs to be adopted by writers in general, but especially ill, disabled, mad writers. And I definitely planned a lot of my writing days out, and I was not able to keep all of them if I had brain fog, or if my depression and my anxiety were particularly bad that day. Or I would write 2 sentences and that would be considered a successful writing day, because those were the only spoons I had, the units of energy that I had. And it was also, I think about Crip time, and I also think about the ways that madness informs that. Because I know for a lot of other mad authors, there's a lot of negative self-talk that our brains are processing, racing thoughts. And so that was something that very much impeded the process of writing. And one of the things that really helped was like literally setting up a writing altar of all the Crips and queers and folks of color that I just value so deeply, so that I wasn't alone in the process. And Nomy, I imagined y'all behind me as I was writing too, just to kind of remember that this is not a solitary act. And I think Crip time allowed for all of those things to happen, for me to take food breaks, make sure I'm hydrated, leave my chair, move. It allowed for me to consider what I needed, which is the heart of disability justice, right? What do you need, and how do you get that? How do you get that access met?
Thank you. Thank you so very much.
Thank you for that question. I appreciate it. And I went ahead and added other folks that introduced me to Crip time in the chat, just in case folks are interested and want to read more.
Yeah, I want to read about that. I have thoughts about Crip time, but I want to know if other people have questions. And if so, I'll hold my thoughts.
And we can chat more later.
Um,
Can I ask a question? Oh, thanks. I wanted to ask both of you, just like, I guess with like learning more about disability justice, it's really, I guess, helped me personally with like my identity and feeling a part of something bigger, and like internalized ableism and saneism. And I was wondering, you were just sort of speaking about that, Shayda, but like if both of you could kind of talk about, I don't know, like some other things like the altar, or the different things that like how you combat, or if you still deal with like internalized ableism and saneism and all that, I was just wondering if you could speak on that, both of you.
Yeah, that's a great question. Nomy, do you want to go first? I can go first.
You go first.
I still have to process internalized saneism, because we live in a sanist world, and those thoughts are going to impede, at least they do for me. And so I feel like it's become very cyclical, and talking to other mad folks about it has been really, really helpful. Following mad content creators online has been really useful. But really just kind of realizing that we're all moving through a very sanist structure. I'm mostly housed in academia, and the university is just notorious for that, right? And so conversations are very helpful, reminders to myself, and things that I write down that I'll read to myself at the end of the month and then burn. I have stones with me at all times, just for grounding, because it's just I've found that I need to find more ways to be tangible in my body, mind, and those are just a few. But community is a very incredible way to just be able to remember that we belong in all the ways that our needs manifest.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing I can say, I could talk about this for a long time, much more than our 2 minutes, no, 0 minutes that we have. But I'll just say quickly that any amount of like self-acceptance that I might come to, I might think like, oh, I've now achieved something, like I'm in this state of like, you know, eradicating these like harmful beliefs that I've had about myself. And then I'm like, but then something changes, like circumstances change. I become more disabled over time. I become fatter over time. I acknowledge things, like I'm in this process of like noticing and admitting that I have like learning disabilities and neurodivergence that's never been diagnosed or named. And so it's like, we get more and more and more opportunities to unlearn our internalized ableism. And I think just like trusting our processes, and that it's actually okay to have that stuff come up. It doesn't mean we're not like being the right kind of Crips, and it just gives us more opportunity to learn and connect with each other. And yeah, I think altars and like, reading tarot is really helpful for me with stuff like that. Herbs are really helpful. Yeah. Thank you for that question.
Thank you all for the beautiful love in the chat.
Thank you. Orca Books is like, I used to live a block from Orca Books and would go there every single day. It's very beloved to me, and I know it's been going through a lot of changes, and I'm just so glad that it continues to exist. So thank you for hosting us.
Thank you so much for letting us host you and for sharing all your words and your wisdom. It's a really beautiful discussion. And thank you everyone for coming into joining us in the Zoom sphere.
Thank you all. Nomy, I feel so fed and a lot more just feeling a lot more grounded than when we started. Thank you so much. Can we take a quick, anybody who'd like to turn their camera on, feel free. Otherwise, I'm going to take a quick selfie just to keep documenting this journey, if that's okay.
Yes, I want to hide non-video participants so that I want to also take a selfie and just have as many faces as possible.
Okay. This child wants to be here too, it looks like.
My BB. Oh, I want my BB too.
Oh yeah, bring the baby over. Heather, it's so good to see you. Hello. Okay, I need a hand actually to press the button.
I'm sorry.
Could you, let's see.
Oh,
you can? Okay.
Yeah, I just did it. I'll send it to you.
Thank you so much. Take good care, everybody. Thank you for being here. Much love. Love you, Nomy.
Love you.